The auction yard smelled like sawdust and old hay, and the morning was cold enough to see your breath. People had come from 3 counties over, filling the wooden bleachers around the sale ring, pulling their coats tight and drinking coffee from tin cups. It was the kind of sale where serious farmers came to find serious animals. Good milking does, thick-shouldered bucks, animals with clean legs and bright eyes and futures worth betting on. Nobody had come for the goats in pen 17. They stood huddled at the back of the enclosure, 27 of them, pressed together like they were trying to disappear. Their ribs showed through dull, rough coats. Their legs were thin as fence rails. A few had bald patches where mange had visited and mostly left. The auctioneer had already walked past them twice without stopping, as if assigning them a number had been courtesy enough. A boy leaning on the fence rail pointed at them and laughed at something his friend said. 2 older farmers nearby shook their heads the way men do when they've already made up their minds. She stood at the rail alone. She was young, not yet 30, and she wore a canvas jacket that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft and uncertain. Her boots were muddy at the toe and cracked along the left heel. She had the hands of someone who had worked every day of her life and expected to work every day after this one, too. She'd driven 2 hours to get here in a truck that burned oil and complained on the hills. And she'd arrived before sunrise to walk the pens before the crowd filled in. She had looked at those goats for a long time, not the way other buyers looked at animals, counting flaws, measuring risk, calculating what they'd have to spend to turn a thin thing into a useful one. She looked the way a person looks when they recognize something. One of the does lifted her head and met her eyes for a moment, and she had felt something settle inside her chest, quiet and certain. She knew what everyone else saw. She also knew what they were missing. The land she'd inherited was up on the east side of the county, on a hillside that hadn't been farmed in nearly 15 years. Briars had taken it completely. Blackthorn, multiflora rose, wild raspberry cane grown so thick and tall that you couldn't see the fence line from the road. Her neighbors called it the Thorn Hill. They said it kindly when they were being polite, and less kindly when they weren't. A banker had told her the soil underneath was probably dead. A neighboring farmer had suggested she sell the acreage before she wasted any more time on it. She had not sold it. When the auctioneer finally called pen 17, the crowd barely stirred. A few people watched out of idle curiosity. Most kept talking among themselves. She raised her hand before the bidding even found its footing. She got them for $11 a head. The auctioneer announced it with the flat voice of a man who had seen stranger things, and a few people in the crowd laughed outright. Not the cruel laughter of people meaning harm, but the easy, unthinking laughter of people who found the whole thing slightly absurd. $11 for 27 goats. A man near the fence post shook his head and said something to the person beside him, and they both smiled. She did not look at them. She was already moving toward the pen. The goats were worse up close. She had known that from a distance, and she let herself see it plainly now without flinching. Their hip bones pressed against their skin like knuckles beneath a thin blanket. Their coats were rough and patchy, the kind of rough that comes from weeks of poor feed and close quarters, not from any permanent damage. She looked at their legs, their hooves, their eyes. The eyes were alert. That mattered more to her than the ribs. She had borrowed a livestock trailer from a neighbor's husband. a quiet man who had not asked many questions and had seemed to understand, or at least to respect, that she was not doing this for anyone else's opinion. She loaded the goats slowly, letting them move at their own pace, coaxing the reluctant ones with a calm, low voice and an open hand. They were skittish, but not mean. A few of them butted against each other in the narrow chute, and she steadied them with a gentle pressure on their flanks until they settled. It took nearly an hour to load all 27. When she pulled out of the fairgrounds lot, she saw two women she recognized from church watching from near the pavilion. One of them raised a hand in greeting, but there was something behind the gesture, a careful look, the kind people give when they are trying to decide if a person is brave or just foolish. She nodded back and kept driving. The road to the Thorn Hill was unpaved for the last half-mile, and the trailer rattled hard over the ruts. She drove slowly, watching the pasture gate come into view at the top of the rise. The briars were already visible from the road, a dense wall of thorn and cane that ran from the east fence line down toward the old stone wall at the bottom. In the afternoon light, the hill looked gray and unwelcoming, the kind of land that seems to have made up its mind about things. She stopped the truck and sat for a moment with the engine idling. Behind her, she could hear the goats shifting in the trailer, their hooves tapping against the metal floor. One of them made a low sound, something between a bleat and a breath, and the sound carried through the cab of the truck like a small and ordinary thing that was, to her, anything but. She got out and unlatched the gate. The gate swung open with a groan that sounded like the hill itself protesting. She left it wide and walked back to the trailer, sliding the latch on the rear door and stepping to the side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the first goat appeared in the opening. A gray one, the one she had started thinking of as the oldest, though she couldn't say why. It stood at the edge of the trailer floor and looked out at the hill the way a person looks at a room they've never been in before. Then it stepped down, and the others followed in a loose and shuffling crowd, their narrow hooves finding the ground one by one. She watched them fan out into the gate opening and stop. They stood close together, ears moving, noses working. The smell of the place was reaching them, dry thorn wood, old grass buried under cane, the faint mineral tang of the soil. One of the smaller ones lowered its head and pulled at a tuft of brown grass near the fence post. Another walked a few steps toward the briars and sniffed along the base of a thicket, its lips parting slightly at whatever it found there. She had read about this, the way a goat will test a new place before committing to it. They were not careless animals. People thought of them as animals that ate anything, and in a way that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. They were choosy in their own fashion. They cataloged things before they consumed them. They worked from the edges in. Within 10 minutes, the herd had spread across the lower portion of the hillside. There was no drama in it, no charge or frenzy. They moved quietly and with a kind of low purpose, and she found herself standing at the gate with her arms folded, watching them work a place she had stood in just 4 days ago, feeling the thorns catch at her sleeves. The evening light was sliding sideways across the hill now, throwing long shadows from the briar canes, and in that light the goats looked almost golden, their rough coats catching the color, their movements unhurried and methodical. She noticed the old gray one had made its way to the thickest section near the east fence and was already pulling at the lower leaves of a briar cluster, stripping them back with a practiced curl of its tongue. She let out a long breath she hadn't known she was holding. The weight of the auction, the drive, the money she no longer had, all of it was still there, sitting in her chest. It didn't disappear in that moment, but something else settled alongside it. A steadiness, the kind that comes not from certainty but from having made the bet, and now watching it begin to play out, one quiet bite at a time. She latched the gate behind her and walked to the truck to get her water jug. She would stay until the light was gone. She sat on the truck's running board with the water jug in both hands, watching the hill in the fading light. The goats had spread themselves across the slope in a loose pattern, each one working its own section. And the hillside was alive now in a way it hadn't been in years, moving, pulling, grazing with a low, persistent industry that felt almost like a sound. Though from this distance she couldn't hear anything beyond the occasional clank of a bell and the dry rustle of cane. She drank slowly and didn't think about tomorrow, yet. That was a discipline she had learned young, from watching people worry themselves flat over seasons not yet arrived. Her grandmother had called it borrowing trouble from weather that hadn't turned. Tonight she would stay here. Tomorrow she would bring water out in the old drum on the flatbed and check the fencing along the north edge, where she'd noticed a soft post. When the light finally went gray and the shapes of the goats became silhouettes on the hill, she counted them out of habit. 27. All present. She tucked the jug back behind the seat and walked the perimeter fence one more time before leaving, running her hand along the wire, testing the tension at each post. It held. The drive back to the homestead was short, maybe 2 miles, but it took her past the feed store where the men sometimes gathered on the bench outside. A couple of them were still there as she turned onto the county road. She didn't look over, but she caught the movement of one of them raising a hand. Not in greeting, she thought, but pointing, indicating. She had no doubt about what they were discussing. The truck with the trailer, now empty. The skinny goats on the Thorn hill. The money spent and the foolishness of it. She kept her eyes on the road. It wasn't that their opinions didn't sting. They did in the way that cold water stings, sharp and immediate and hard to ignore. But she had made the calculation before she made the purchase, and she had made it again, standing at the gate, watching the old gray one strip that first briar cluster with such calm certainty. The goats knew what to do with the land, because the land was familiar to them in ways a tractor never could be. And she had known what to do with the goats because she had listened, years ago, to an old woman explain what happens to thorn ground when you give it the right mouths to work it. That knowledge had cost her nothing. It was the only thing she owned that no drought or lean year or dismissive neighbor could take from her. She pulled up to the homestead, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark cab. The night insects had started up, and the sound of them came through the cracked window like a tide. She needed to eat something. She needed to mend the gap she had spotted in the east corner before morning. She got out and went inside. She ate standing at the counter, cold biscuit and a heel of hard cheese, because sitting down felt like stopping, and she could not afford to stop yet. The east corner gap would not mend itself overnight, and if even one goat slipped through onto the neighbor's property by morning, she would hear about it in a way that would follow her to the feed store and back. She wrapped the rest of the cheese in cloth, drank a long cup of water, and went back out. The moon had come up enough to see by. She carried the wire roll on one shoulder, and the fencing pliers in her coat pocket, and walked the perimeter of the hill pasture in the silver light, one hand trailing the fence line, feeling for loose posts and weak wire the way a person reads a page by running a finger under the words. She found the gap where she had spotted it, low down near the ground, where the wire had pulled from the post staple on one side and gone slack. An old break, probably, that the previous owner had never bothered with because this corner of the property was where the thorn growth was thickest, and nobody had reason to walk it. She crouched and worked the wire back, driving the staple tight with the flat of the pliers, then added a second one above it for good measure. Her hands were cold and the metal bit at her fingers, but she worked steadily. When it held firm, she tested it twice, pulling the wire toward her and releasing it, feeling the tension come back clean each time. It would do. She walked the rest of the perimeter before going in. Not because she expected another weak point, but because she wanted to see the hill at night, wanted to hear the goats settling. They had clustered near the upper ridge in the dark, a loose grouping of shadows against the thorn brush, some of them lying down already, some still moving slowly among the briars with that same quiet persistence they had shown all day. The old gray one was standing apart from the others near a dense thicket, and even in the dim light she could see it was still working, pulling at something low and woody, unhurried as though the night made no particular difference to its task. She watched it for a while. There was something in the animal's steadiness that reached her. The hill looked the same as it had this morning, brown and sharp and uninviting, and she knew that anyone driving past tomorrow would still see nothing worth remarking on. The change that was happening was underground, where the roots were being disturbed for the first time in years, and in the slow accumulation of stripped branches and cleared ground that would only become visible after many more days of this patient work. The town would not see it yet. She had expected that. What mattered was that the goats had eaten through the first ring of growth and would push deeper tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. She slept that night on the thin mattress in the back room of the farmhouse, the one with the window that never quite closed all the way, and she listened to the wind moving across the hillside. She could not see the goats from where she lay, but she could hear them sometimes. A low shifting sound, the occasional soft knock of hooves on stone. It was enough. She knew they were there. Morning came gray and damp, the sky the color of old pewter, and she was out before full light with a bucket of water and a handful of dried corn she had been rationing carefully. She walked the fence line first, checking every post, every wire. One section near the lower corner had a staple working loose, and she pressed it back with the heel of her palm and made a note to drive it properly later with a hammer. Small things left unattended had a way of becoming large problems, and she could not afford a large problem right now. The goats rose when they heard her. Even the thin ones, the ones that had seemed half gone when she brought them home, came to their feet with a kind of expectant energy that pleased her. She poured the water into the long trough she had set along the fence and watched them crowd toward it. The old gray one came last, unhurried as always, and drank with a deep steadiness that she had come to think of as its natural way of doing everything. She ate her own breakfast standing at the fence, a piece of bread and some cold coffee from the morning before, watching the goats begin to move back into the brush as the light grew. They needed no direction. They had already learned where the work was. That afternoon, her nearest neighbor came by in his truck, the one who farmed the flat bottomland just east of her property. He slowed when he reached the stretch of road that ran along the base of her hill. She saw him lean toward the passenger window and look up at the slope for a long moment before he pulled onto the gravel shoulder and stepped out. She walked down to meet him at the fence. He was a quiet man, not unkind, but he had been one of the ones standing at the back of the auction yard when she had led the goats out. And she remembered the way he had shaken his head without quite looking at her. He looked at the hillside now. The goats were spread across the midsection, picking steadily at the thicket. From the road, you could see the first real signs of it if you knew where to look. Patches where the density of the briars had thinned, places where raw ground showed through between stripped stems. It was not dramatic, not yet, but it was real. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply that he had not expected them to work so hard. She said they had surprised her too, in the best way possible. He stood there a little longer than she expected. His hands rested on the top fence rail, and he looked up the slope with the careful, measuring kind of attention that farmers give to things they are trying to understand rather than simply judge. She had seen that look before on her father's face, usually when he was watching the sky before rain, reading something invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning to read it. She did not push the silence. She had learned early that silence on a farm was rarely empty. After a moment, he asked how many she had started with. She told him 27. He nodded slowly, as though the number meant something now that it had not meant before. He asked if she had lost any. She told him no, not one. He turned his head slightly at that, not quite looking at her but acknowledging it. She told him she had moved them in a rotating pattern, working the worst sections first, the densest tangles at the top where the old stone wall ran, and then letting them drift down as the growth opened. She had watched where they ate heaviest and guided them back to those spots when the new shoots tried to come up. She had learned to read their preferences. The older animals, the ones who had been on rough ground before, those were her teachers. They knew which stems were worth stripping and which were not yet ready. She had followed their lead more than once. He was quiet again. Then he said he had always heard that goats would eat anything, but that was not the same as saying they would work. She agreed. There was a difference between an animal that consumed and an animal that cleared. Hers were clearing. He looked back at the hillside. One of the older does had climbed to a high point near the wall and stood there with her head raised, looking out over the lower land the way something confident does when it has claimed a place. He watched her for a moment. She could see that he was recalculating something, some earlier conclusion he had quietly held. He asked, without quite making it a question, whether she thought the soil underneath would be workable once the roots were gone. She said she believed it would. She told him about what she had found in the low corner after the first week, how the goat traffic had broken the crust, and she had pushed her hand into the loosened earth and found dark, damp soil beneath, not the pale, dry clay she had expected. He received that without comment, but she could tell it landed. He pushed back from the fence and settled his hat. He said he supposed he owed her an apology, or something close to one. She told him it was not necessary. He said he figured it probably was, and he was sorry all the same. She watched him walk back to his truck. He did not look embarrassed, only honest. which she respected more than she would have admitted to him just then. After he drove away, she stood at the fence a little longer than she needed to. The apology had settled something in her that she had not known was unsettled. She had not wanted his approval, had not been working toward it. But there was a difference between not needing a thing and not feeling its weight when it was finally set down. She breathed it out slowly and turned back to the hill. The goats had spread wide across the upper slope by now, working in the loose, unhurried way they always did when the vegetation was good. She counted them without thinking, the habit so fixed in her by then that she could not look at the hill without her mind moving through the herd. All 27. She had not lost a single one. That fact still surprised her some mornings. When she had first led them onto the property, 2 of the smaller ones had been so thin she could trace the curve of every rib with her eyes from 20 feet away. She had not told anyone, but on the 3rd night she had gone out with a lantern and sat beside the smallest of them in the dark, just to be sure the animal was still breathing. It had been. It had looked at her with that sideways, untroubled goat patience, and she had felt faintly ridiculous and deeply relieved at the same time. Now that same animal was near the top of the hill, pulling at a dense tangle of greenbrier that would have turned a man with loppers back inside an hour. She had filled out, her coat had come in thicker, and she moved with a certainty that matched the terrain like she had been made for it, which, in every practical sense, she had. The lower third of the hill was almost unrecognizable now. The soil there had been turned and worked by hooves and browsing until it lay open and loose, dark in the morning shadow and catching light differently than the clay farther up. Grass was already threading up through it in places, not the tough, wiry growth that had struggled through the crust before, but soft new growth, the kind that came when soil had air and moisture working in it again. She walked the fence line to where the corner post sat, the one she had reinforced herself in the 2nd week, when the ground had softened enough to reset it properly. She pressed her boot against the base of it. It did not move. Small things like that still gave her a plain, uncomplicated satisfaction. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket. She kept notes not for anyone else but for herself, a record of the hill's changes, which sections had cleared fastest, where the soil was responding, where the briars were deepest, and would need more time. She opened to the page she had marked that morning and added 3 lines. A sound from the road made her look up. A truck was slowing near the gate, but it was not the neighbor's. This one she did not recognize. The truck pulled to a stop just past the gate, and the engine cut. She stood still near the fence post, notebook still open in her hand, watching. A man climbed out from the driver's side. He was older, dressed in plain work clothes, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had taken years of hard use. He looked at the hill first, before he looked at her. That was the thing she noticed. He did not glance at it the way most people did, scanning it the way you'd scan a wall. He looked at it the way you look at something you are trying to understand. She closed her notebook and walked toward him. He had his hat in his hand by the time she reached the gate. He introduced himself as a man from a county over, said he had heard about the hill from someone at the feed store. She did not ask which someone. Word moved through feed stores and auction yards the way water moved through low ground, quietly and without asking permission. He wanted to know what she had used. She told him. 27 goats, she said. The ones from the Hendersons' dispersal sale. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a thing confirms what he already suspected. She opened the gate and he followed her up the lower slope, without waiting to be asked, which told her he was the kind of man who had spent his life on land, and knew that the way to understand a piece of ground was to walk it. He stopped at the edge where the old briar line had been thickest. There was very little left of it now. Broken stems, root ends exposed and drying in the pale morning air, and beneath them the loosened soil she had noted in her book. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers into it. She watched him. He did not say anything for a moment. He had land, he said finally, rising from the crouch. A back section that had gone to brush over 10 years after a wet spell took out the drainage, and he hadn't been able to keep up with it alone. He had priced brush clearing twice and turned the estimates over in his hands and set them back down both times. She did not offer him anything yet. She let him say what he had come to say. He asked if the goats were for hire. The question landed quietly between them. She had not thought about it in those terms. The goats were hers, bought with her last money, kept through the cold weeks, moved across the hill in the careful rotations she had planned, and adjusted as she learned. They were not tools she had thought of lending out, but she heard something in the question, some opening that was larger than it first appeared, and she turned it over the way she turned soil in her mind before she answered. She said she would think on it. She thought on it for 3 days. She thought on it while she moved the goats in their morning rotation, watching them spread across the upper section where the last of the briars had thinned to pale stubble. She thought on it while she hauled water and patched the lower fence line where a soft post had finally given. She thought on it in the evenings when the light went copper and the hill was quiet and she could see the full shape of what she had done, the green running up the slope in long even bands like something waking up in stages. The question was not simply whether to say yes or no. The question was what kind of thing this was becoming. She had bought the goats to save her land. That was the whole of it when she started. She had not bought them to build something larger. But the hill had changed, and the goats had changed with it, and she had changed too, learning their rhythms and their stubbornness and the particular way each animal moved through brush, which ones led and which ones followed, which ones needed watching on a new piece of ground. That knowledge had not come cheap. It had come through cold mornings and sore hands and long quiet weeks of paying attention when there was nothing visible yet to pay attention to. If she lent the goats out, she lent all of that with them. On the second evening, she walked the boundary of her own land and tried to see it the way a stranger might. The hill was not finished. The lower northeast corner still held a dense run of old multiflora that would need another full rotation before it broke down properly. The soil. There was still hard-packed beneath the roots, not yet open enough to hold what she wanted to plant in spring. She needed the goats where they were, but the man had said 10 years. 10 years of brush reclaiming what had once been pasture. She understood that kind of loss. She had seen it in her own hill when she first walked it, the way the land forgot itself under the weight of what grew over it. On the third morning, she went to find him. He was working a fence on the far side of his property, a slow, careful job, replacing wire one section at a time. He looked up when he heard her coming down the road, and he set his tools down and waited. She told him she would bring the goats to his back section in the late spring after her northeast corner was cleared. She told him she would need to walk the land first, see the brush, understand what she was working with. She told him what she expected in return. Not much, a fair amount, stated plainly, and she watched his face as she said it. He nodded. He said that was fair. He asked if she wanted to walk the land now. She said she did. They walked through a gap in the fence line where the wire had long since rusted and sagged to the ground, and she stepped over it carefully, the dry grass catching at her boots. The back section of his property opened before her like a held breath. She had known from the road that it was bad, but standing inside it was different. The brush was not random. It had organization to it, the way neglect always finds its own kind of order. Hawthorn and blackberry ran in long, tangled rows where old fence lines had been. Sumac had spread from the low corners and pushed up the slope in dense clumps, each one throwing shade wide enough to kill the grass beneath it. Wild multiflora rose had threaded itself through everything, the canes arching and rooting where they touched the ground, building new plants from old ones, stitching the whole mess together into something that looked impenetrable. She walked slowly. She pressed into the edges of the thickets with her boot, testing the ground beneath. In some places, the soil was still open, still holding a memory of grass roots, loose enough that she could feel it give. In other places, the sumac had packed the surface hard with its own leaf litter, years of it, a dry, papery layer that had smothered whatever tried to grow underneath. She noted where the water moved. She could read the slope, the way a low crease ran through the center of the section and gathered whatever rain came. The brush was heaviest there, which told her two things. The water was good, and the goats would work that crease last, not first, because the stems there would be thicker and harder. She told him this as they walked. She told him she would start the goats on the upper edges where the growth was younger and the soil was better exposed. She told him the sumac would take time, because goats would eat the leaves and the young growth, but avoid the older woody trunks until hunger pressed them harder. She told him the rose was the real problem, thorny enough to slow even her goats, but not impossible. They had worked through worse on her own hill. He listened. He did not interrupt. He asked one question, quiet and honest, about whether the goats would damage what grass remained. She told him the opposite was true. She told him the goats would open the canopy, let the light reach the ground, and the old root systems still living in the soil would respond to that light before anything else could. She had seen it happen on her own hill within 2 weeks of the goats arriving. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said he wished he had done something about this land years ago. She said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say. What mattered was what came next. The spring, the goats, and what the hillside still held beneath everything that had grown over it. They agreed on terms before the first frost settled in. She would bring her goats over in early spring, after the mud firmed enough to hold their hooves without them sinking past the ankle. She would manage the rotation herself, moving them section by section the way she had learned on her own hill. He would provide water access from the lower pipe and leave the fencing decisions to her. He did not argue with any of it. A man who had spent years watching that hillside get worse had learned, at least, to stop arguing. Winter passed the way winters did on that kind of land. slow and cold and full of small tasks that kept a farm alive without advancing it. She checked her goats every morning, kept their hay dry, watched their weight, and thought about the neighbor's hill the way a person thinks about a problem that already has a solution, not with worry, but with patience. When the ground softened and the days lengthened, she moved her herd across the county road and up into the lower edge of his overgrown hillside. 27 goats, every one of them still thin by the standards of the feed store crowd, still rough-coated and ordinary-looking to anyone passing by. But they knew what to do. They had always known. She had simply given them the chance. They worked his hill the way they had worked hers, methodically, hungrily, without complaint. She rotated them upward over the following weeks, watching the soil emerge behind them. The briars fell back. The sumac dropped its young growth. The rose canes got chewed down to the older wood, slowing the goats the way she had told him they would, but not stopping them. Nothing stopped them for long. By midsummer, the first green flush came. Not planted, not seeded, not coaxed from a bag or a bottle. It came from the ground itself, from root systems that had waited years beneath the thorn cover for enough light to reach them. She stood at the fence line and watched it happen the same way she had watched it happen on her own land, with the same quiet feeling that the earth had simply been waiting for someone to ask the right question. He came down from the house one afternoon and stood beside her without saying much. He looked at his hill and then he looked at her goats. After a while, he said it looked different than he had expected. She said most things did once they were actually happening. He offered her a fair price for the season's work, and she accepted it without negotiation, because it was fair and because fairness was worth honoring when it appeared. She walked her goats home that evening along the county road with the late sun behind her, 27 animals moving together through the golden light, their hooves quiet on the packed dirt. Nobody laughed. Nobody had anything left to say. The hills on both sides of that road were green, and she had made them so.